All righty. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Very exciting presentation, and I am, particularly excited to kind of review this one with everybody. As it was kind of one that often comes up in my practice, but as well, I've had lots of questions around it as to what is insulin resistance, what is the role that it plays within regards to weight management and all that various things in that respect. So we're pretty much going to dive right into it. I will ask that everyone saves your questions until the end of the presentation. We'll have plenty of time to go through them all, whatever they might be, whether it's back on specific slides or what have you. We'll go over at that point. So let's get to it. And for those of you that don't know me, my name is Dan, and I am the founder of Healthcare Evolution. And these are all, well, I've been putting these on since January. All right. So as always, here's a few of my disclosures, just so you guys are aware that where I'm coming from, what I'm affiliated with, associated with, and that sort of thing. So as I said, I am the founder of Healthcare Evolution. I've been paid a number of consulting, contracting fees with various organizations, including Novo Nordisk and SRX Pharmacy, as well as a few other organizations. I have grant funding for a couple of research projects that are currently ongoing, as well as I sit on an advisory board for the CPHA, or the Pharmacy Examination Board of Canada, my apologies. And this one has not received any speakers fees or support of any kind. So it's, it's kind of just been put together for you and for my patients and anybody else that's tuning in. This event is being recorded for promotional purposes and for Facebook, YouTube, that sort of thing. These videos will be loaded up onto YouTube. So if you want to review them again or whatnot, you can go take a look there. They'll be up usually about a week after the presentation is complete. And they'll be put onto other various social media content and places, but any names or voices or anything like that will all be removed prior to that going up on various channels. So the learning objectives for tonight. I really believe in knowledge is power. So I think too often what ends up happening with patients and people in the healthcare system is you don't have a good enough understanding as to like, what are we actually dealing with when you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you have insulin resistance. Well, what does that exactly mean? What is going on inside of my body? How do I know, I'm having these symptoms, that sort of thing? What is there to piece together, and what can I kind of do about it? So I like to really describe and kind of give a bit of a background as to what's happening there and kind of dive into what do we know about it. And in particular, this idea of whether obesity causes insulin resistance or does insulin resistance cause obesity? So weight gain and that sort of thing. Very, very interesting, and really kind of sent me down a rabbit hole of discovering and learning a whole bunch of new information. As well, we'll review some of the strategies and how you manage insulin resistance and how it pertains to your weight. So let's do a little bit of a background here. First and foremost, we're going to talk about what is insulin. And insulin is a hormone that's released from our pancreas. And as you can kind of see here, it's like a little upside down Nike symbol, if you will, that sits below the stomach or kind of around the stomach, below the liver. And it always looks yellow in the physiology and anatomy textbooks and stuff like that. But it serves a very important role in terms of producing a lot of our hormones and regulatory patterns and stuff like that to keep our body functioning and keep our metabolism and such going. And in particular, the main one is insulin. So insulin's main function is to regulate the nutrients in our body. Now, most people associate insulin with sugar and blood sugar, but insulin also plays a very important role in terms of protein maintenance, fat uptake, vitamins, minerals, all that kind of good stuff. It really has a role in all the nutrients that are coming into the system. So when you eat a meal, the nutrients, you go into your stomach, they go through your digestive process, through your stomach, into your small intestine, and you start absorbing those said nutrients. And they enter your bloodstream, and as they rise in the bloodstream, the body starts to get signals that, hey, we need to manage these levels are starting to go up. And so insulin and other molecules start to get released in order to manage and bring down and mitigate those nutrients into their various spaces where they need to go. So insulin shuttles a number of nutrients. And as I said, sugar is the main one. And I always like to think of insulin kind of like a key, if you will. So in order to manage the nutrients, as I said, they need to be taken up by the cells of our body. And that big in part is because if these nutrients just floated around our bloodstream, they would get to high enough concentrations that they would become toxic. So in particular, high blood sugars, if you've ever had hyperglycemia, they call it. High blood sugars certainly can be damaging and be harmful at very, very high levels where an individual could potentially end up in the hospital. So we want to bring those nutrient concentrations down, but also the cells in our body need these nutrients in order to function and do our day-to-day activities, the cell things that they do, whether it's walking, going to work, you name it, our cells need these nutrients in order to properly function. Essentially, these nutrients are the fuel for our cells. And when I talk about insulin being a key, essentially each of our cells kind of like has a door. And essentially it's a little channel that insulin can go and open up that said door. And what it'll end up doing is it will um, open up the door and allow the nutrients to go from the bloodstream inside of the cells, and they get taken up, and then that brings the nutrient levels down. In the case of sugar and glucose, muscle is the primary one, taking up about 80%. Liver takes up the rest of it, and then adipose and fat cells. So they'll take up any remaining amounts that might be sticking around or hanging out in excess, if you will. All right. So here's a bit of a breakdown of the various nutrients. Now, these are the three main macronutrients that we look at. I'm sure you've heard of macronutrients and micronutrients. Micronutrients are your minerals, vitamins, all that kind of stuff, just they're in small amounts that we need to take them in. Whereas our macronutrients, macro means large, nutrients means nutrients. So these are the three large nutrients that we need to take in. The first one here is protein. And I'm sure many of you have heard me talk about protein and how vitally important it is, in the sense that it's a building block. It's a building block for our muscles, basically every single cellular process in the body. And too much protein, as with anything, will eventually get converted to sugar and then get stored as fat. So if you've taken in your over your daily requirements, the extra protein isn't going to have any more use for the various cells and muscle cells throughout your body, and it'll get converted and stored as fat. Carbohydrates, the main one here in terms of working with insulin, absorbed as sugar or glucose, and there's kind of the individual glucose molecules that gets taken up from our intestine. Glucose or sugar is our main energy source. This really is the fuel that gets us through our day-to-day, particularly our brain. Our brain loves glucose. It sucks as much of it up as it possibly can for all the various activities and thinking that we often need to do on a day-to-day basis. Carbohydrates can also be stored in the muscle and liver as glycogen. And again, any excess sugar that's kicking around is going to get converted to fatty acids and then stored as fat. And then we have fat. Now, a lot of people, we want to lose fat, we want to get rid of fat, but fat is vitally important. We need to get fat from our diet because fat plays a lot of different roles and has a lot of different effects in the body outside of energy production and energy storage, if you will. So it gets taken up as fatty acids and monoglycerides. So you can kind of see it's big, long chains. And they don't like sitting in water. They like to be wrapped in lipids and other like molecules with it. So it often gets transported in our bloods as various, basically look like little balls, and lipids are all in the middle, and they kind of create a more water-friendly barrier on the outside so that it can get transferred through the bloodstream to the various places that it needs to be, and in order to do what it needs to do. And so it not only is used in terms of our cell membranes, but it also can be stored as fat if there's any excess of it, as with everything else. So, what is insulin resistance? That is the big question. So sometimes our cells will no longer be responding to insulin in the same way. They become less sensitive. And in a sense, what used to, one key of insulin was effective for, suddenly it's like there's more locks on the door of our cells. And those locks, we need more insulin or more keys to open up those doors to allow the nutrients to go from the bloodstream inside of the cell. So this resistance aspect, it's like someone's attached a whole bunch of extra locks and fundamentally made it harder for the nutrients to travel from the bloodstream inside of the cell. And so we call it insulin resistance because insulin isn't as effective as it was previously. So what essentially happens is the pancreas, says, hey, I've released my usual amount of insulin. I don't know what's going on here, but the blood sugar and nutrient levels are still high. Like, why isn't it going down? So what the pancreas is going to do to counteract that is it needs to produce more insulin. It needs to overcome that resistance because it's detecting that, hey, these nutrient levels are too high. This could be bad for the being. Our cells aren't getting the fuel that they need. And so we need more insulin. We need to get those doors open, and we need to get those nutrients traveling from the bloodstream inside of the various cells. And at first, as any good organ or good little worker, the pancreas can keep up. And based on your blood work, if you go to the doctor, I'm sure many of you have heard of hemoglobin A1C or a fasting blood sugar. Those are all going to look normal. They'll look perfectly normal on an actual blood test, and there won't be any detected issues or problems at that point in time because the pancreas is compensating. Essentially, it's producing enough insulin to keep those sugar levels down and managed. However, I always like to use the analogy that, the pancreas in this situation, it's kind of like running your car at red line. If you were to keep that car running at red line and do it continuously, what's ultimately going to happen is eventually that engine just isn't going to work anymore. It's going to blow up on you and you're not going to have nearly the amount of horsepower, efficiency, that sort of thing. Same thing with the pancreas. Our cells that produce the insulin, we call them your beta cells, will actually start to break down and eventually die because they just cannot keep up with the demand. The supply of glucose is too high, and it just says, we tried, we just can't do it anymore. And so this is kind of the course that we often see. And this is generally insulin resistance has a good chance that it can lead to type 2 diabetes, not in every situation, but certainly is the possibility. So as I said, this blue line here is your glucose level, yellow is your insulin, and then red is kind of your insulin resistance. So as you can see, as the insulin resistance goes up, your insulin production goes up and it matches and manages it and keeps your blood sugar levels looking pretty decent. You might start showing on some tests, there might be a bit of an impairment, a bit of a problem. We need to do something about that. Maybe, maybe not, or we'll just kind of doing watchful waiting and doing lifestyle measures and such like that. But eventually that insulin production starts to go down, your beta cells are starting to die off, and that glucose level will start to go up. And it's at this point in time where we may get the diagnosis of type 2 diabetes possibly. And so that'll be where your A1C is greater than 7%, or your fasting sugars are showing to be greater than 7. Generally, we need 2 confirmatory blood tests in order to say yay or nay as to whether someone has diabetes or not. And I just want to add a quick note here because there's often a bit of a confusion as to what's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. A lot of people think that they're both one and the same. So type 1 diabetes, generally, I mean, not always, there's lots of cases where it happens later in life, but generally this happens in, when you're a child, in your younger years, pediatrics, that sort of thing. And it's an autoimmune condition where basically your body has developed, oops, go back. No. Where your body has basically developed and starts attacking your own pancreas, your own beta cells. And essentially what ends up happening is your insulin production just shuts off altogether. And so individuals that have type 1 diabetes, they need to be on insulin. They really don't have a choice in the matter if they want to be able to survive and continue living. That insulin is absolutely necessary to be replaced because their body just doesn't produce it anymore. Whereas type 2 diabetes, it's more that the insulin production is still ongoing. It's still continuing. It's just the tissue is not responding. Like I said, the tissue has become resistant to the insulin and it's just not responding in the same way that it had previously. And so over time, the insulin production is going to start going down as that insulin or the pancreas, starts to burn out. So let's dive a little bit into kind of some of the science, and I'll tell you guys a little bit about the rabbit hole that I went down into. That was, it was really quite a great deal of fun. So looking at this aspect and whether obesity causes type 2 diabetes or whether type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance cause obesity. So to take you back to the 1950s, if we looked at just kind of a couple of observations, in the 1950s, we saw that when you took on a net positive energy balance, so when you overconsume the amount of calories that you need, what you ended up having is you would gain weight, you would gain fat mass, and you would have obesity. So the belief was one gets fat by eating too much food. Again, in the 1950s, what they found is that if individuals lost 10% of their baseline weight, all of a sudden we could see a disappearance of diabetes and insulin resistance. So again, it was kind of the idea that, well, when you eat too much and you gain weight, we get the diabetes. And when we take it away and we reduce your fat, all of a sudden the diabetes goes away. So that's the current idea. And that's very much that obesity and diabetes are strongly associated and the two seem to be interplayed. In fact, it seems that obesity causes the diabetes. But is that the entire story? So if we look at, well, we'll kind of just, yeah, is the question of, is insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes potentially the cause of obesity? They're both strongly associated. The studies all show that they go up together, but is one causing the other or vice versa? We don't really have that teased out. We've kind of just made these observations that, as an observation, they make sense, right? You see the weight go up, type 2 diabetes develops. But is the type 2 diabetes or that insulin resistance kind of hanging out in the background, causing all these issues, causing this weight gain, and then it just progressively gets worse with the weight? So let's look at a couple of stats. 63% of Canadian adults are considered to be overweight or have obesity. Now, 26.8% are considered to have obesity, so that's a BMI that's greater than 30, and 36.3% are considered overweight, so that's a BMI 25 to 29.9. Yes, I know the BMI is not the greatest measure or most effective measurement or tool on an individual level, but on epidemiology and population statistics, it can be quite useful in this respect. Now, that's 63% of adults have obesity. 89% of individuals with type 2 diabetes are considered to be overweight and have obesity. 13.4% of those individuals with obesity have diabetes versus 2.9% of individuals at normal weight. So a lot more people have obesity and diabetes, but not everyone who has obesity develops diabetes. So now this kind of goes the other way in terms of this idea between diabetes and obesity and insulin resistance and which one is causing which, because, you know, if obesity was the main driver that developed diabetes, that kind of makes sense in the fact that everyone that has diabetes develops obesity. But why doesn't everybody that have obesity have diabetes? There's kind of that misconnect there, if you will. So hopefully you are not too confused yet, but the biggest thing is that we really aren't 100% sure. We can't really answer the question as to whether the insulin resistance leads to the weight gain and the obesity, or if it is the weight gain that leads to the insulin resistance. Likely what the data really showed is that it's a number of coinciding factors. There's multiple things that are intersecting that are causing actually both conditions to ultimately come about and to be realized, if you will. And the science and stuff like that is still ongoing. There's a lot of controversy. There's a lot of underlying theories and stuff like that. And I think there's been, well, from what I was reading anyways, too much of a focus of trying to find just this one single driver. Like everybody wants to find the one thing that is causing it all. And unfortunately, I think in this situation, that's just not going to be the case. It's going to be a little bit different, and it's not going to be a nice, easy ride to figure out what exactly is going on here. And so for some people, you know, obesity may lead to them developing diabetes, and some people maybe not, and vice versa. So a lot of science to potentially be teased out there, ongoing, if you will. Personally, from my opinion, based on what I kind of read through the literature and stuff like that, and looking at mechanistically what's happening on like a cellular level, I kind of went back to my whole cell bio in like my second year of university, made my brain bleed a little bit. But what I found and what I kind of am leaning towards is that insulin resistance, the pathology and the mechanisms of how that is leading to, you know, causing it, I believe that is the reason that's causing obesity and weight gain versus obesity being the cause of insulin resistance and diabetes. So that's just kind of some of my opinion. I know I have some healthcare providers on the line here tonight. If you want to chat the actual pathophysiology and a little bit more background on that, feel free to shoot me an email afterwards. Would be happy to chat about a little bit more in detail. And if there's anybody that has any particular questions, we can definitely go in that a little bit more deeply and just kind of some of the mechanisms that are ongoing in that respect and how I kind of formed that conclusion, if you will. I got a couple of questions here. All right, what's the chat? Sorry, guys. Okay, so as I said, there's no easy answer, and there's likely multiple factors going on here, including genetics, inactivity, obesity, so weight gain, smoking, a lack of sleep, and inflammation potentially, fatty acids, overnutrition. Various things are kind of ongoing and definitely a concern here in this respect. These have all been associated with insulin resistance and diabetes. And so again, it's not a quick, easy answer as to figuring out what exactly is going on. In reality, though, I think focusing too much on just insulin resistance and the weight gain aspect, really we're kind of looking at a small piece of the larger puzzle, if you will. So metabolic syndrome is becoming more and more mainstream in terms of the term that we're classifying it as. Unfortunately, in terms of the literature and stuff like that, we're still don't really have a nailed down definition as to what metabolic syndrome actually is. But it's not a disease, and it's more of a clustering of various abnormalities that can happen in the body. And some of them can happen, all of them can happen, one or two of them can happen. And there's various definitions as to when an individual has metabolic syndrome or not. So again, not an easy answer, but these are some of the things that we would be looking at. So if you have extra weight, particularly around your abdomen, what that indicates is that there's likely more visceral fat. So there's a lot more fat between your various organs and stuff like that. And what we know with that visceral fat is that it produces a lot of inflammatory marker or molecules that can be a lot more harmful to the adjacent organs. And since it's in that close proximity, those inflammatory markers and such can get there and really cause some issues and problems, if you will. Again, insulin resistance is another marker. High triglycerides, high cholesterol levels, so your bad LDL, and a reduction in your good cholesterol or the HDL, and high blood pressure as well. And as I said, here's some honorable mentions that kind of get added in or not. So fatty liver, an increase in inflammation, increased risk of clots, and potentially reproduction issues in that respect. So a lot of things that potentially could be contributing. And again, there's no one size fits all, and everyone's going to be a little bit different. But metabolic syndrome as a whole, if you have, say, insulin resistance and multiple factors of metabolic syndrome, your risk of developing type 2 diabetes increases dramatically, up to 5 times. Similarly, heart disease goes way up. So having a heart attack or a stroke, you essentially double your risk compared to an individual that doesn't have these metabolic syndrome features. So it's definitely a concern in that respect because, yeah, that's becoming it's becoming a global epidemic. More and more people are developing metabolic syndrome, and the rates are just continuing to go up and up and up and up. So this is really something that the healthcare field we're kind of starting to look at and really need to find a way to help mitigate and manage, because it's going to become a worse and worse problem over time. All right, so that's all kind of the background. I hope that all kind of made sense for you. And now we'll kind of just dive into, yeah, how do we do? What do we do about it? It's like, great, yeah, I have, insulin resistance or I have high blood pressure. That's awesome. Thanks, appreciate it. What do we do about it? How can we manage it? What's something that we can look at? And if any of you have ever tuned into any of my previous webinars, I like to talk about the boring basics. And it's because the boring basics, they work. They're so effective. And yeah, it really just comes down to looking at these things in terms of lifestyle modifications. Insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, there certainly is medications, and as well, I'll briefly touch on bariatric surgery as well. So dietary patterns. The classic Western diet, North American diet, is high calories, high cholesterol, lots of saturated fat, refined sugar, so candies, gummies, that sort of thing. It does have a good amount of protein, salt, and is generally low in fibers, not a ton of veggies. And what essentially happens is a lot of individuals, they overconsume on processed food, and then they add that to a lack of activity. And really, it is not a good situation. Those two right there are very highly correlated with issues of metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance and such. So there are no good and bad foods. I always like to highlight this, that food is just food. And a lot of people tend to classify, this is good food or this is bad for me, and they go back and forth. And I always like to, again, use the analogy, food is like your friends. There is some friends you like to hang out with a lot, and there's some friends you like to hang out with a little bit less. And that's really where the moderation comes from. You see, you need to first, anytime you're looking at kind of a change in your dietary patterns, you need to focus on the foods that you actually enjoy and making sure there's a nice balance of the foods that are really delicious, because let's be serious here, processed foods, they taste fantastic. They have been engineered to literally light up the dopamine center of your brain in ways that, various street drugs could do similarly. So they've been engineered that way, and so they taste delicious. And they're not bad, they're just food, but we want to have a little bit less of it. So we want to make sure that we're incorporating both healthy and nutritious food more often, but finding that balance, because that is what's going to ultimately make sustainability happen and make it something that you can do over the long term. So our main goals when we're looking at our food intake and our dietary patterns, we want to try and decrease the salt intake. That's definitely a marker for increasing your blood pressure. Seeing how much cholesterol and in particular saturated fat intake. Saturated fat is being implicated more and more and more and more in driving your LDL levels up. And LDL is a major marker that we look at in terms of heart attack and stroke risk in that respect. And then increase unprocessed food. So the more natural food is, or the more it is closely related to when they just pulled it off the farm or what have you, the better it's going to be. So looking at your grains, your rices, breads, they've been ground and made into flour and mixed with other ingredients. So that's more of a processed food versus the original grains themselves. So always trying to get as unprocessed as you possibly can and making your own meals at home, preparing them and putting them together. And then as well, focusing on high fiber, unsaturated fats, nutritious protein sources. And yeah, that can really be a big win for you in a lot of ways. Now, the big thing here as well is you want to avoid the extremes. There is some evidence to show that keto and intermittent fasting, these two dietary patterns can be beneficial in insulin resistance. And I'm sure you may have a friend or have read something on the internet where an individual has reversed their insulin resistance by going on the keto diet. And my biggest thing with these diets is, yes, they have that evidence, but you can do the same thing with lower carb portions or just a diet that isn't as extreme. Because when we go to the extreme of keto and intermittent fasting, the thing is sustainability is the issue. And I have conversations with patients every single week that just cannot sustain these sorts of diets, particularly intermittent fasting. They cannot maintain the consistency. It doesn't work for their life and their lifestyle with kids and family. And yeah, it's always a big problem. And ultimately, that's kind of why people end up coming off of it and just not being successful with it in the long term. If you want more info on intermittent fasting and ketosis and such like that, check out my previous webinars. I did 2 more in depth, not only on intermittent fasting, but also on ketogenic diets, low carb diets, and that sort of thing. As well, I strongly dislike specific diets. So the number of patients that get referred to me and they say, well, my doctor said I need to go on a diabetic diet. In my opinion, there is no diabetic diet. Again, it's just food and it's moderation in all things. Ultimately, the diabetic diet, people start focusing more on lower carb. And yes, maybe we should be looking at more low GI foods. But again, we've got to find that balance of ultimately what works for you. And I find when we start going down these specific diets for these specific conditions, they ultimately get too restrictive and we run into the same problems that we get with keto and intermittent fasting, is they just aren't sustainable in the long term. And in my practice, these are kind of some points that I always like to bring about for patients. And in particular, when people tell me that they do, keto or low carb or what have you, generally what happens for most of my patients when we actually look at, say, a food diary and what they're eating on a day to day, they're still eating more carbs than what they should be in order to achieve what would be considered true ketosis. So they're eating more carbs in that respect. It's more just that they've now lowered their carb portion to what would be a regular, more appropriate carb portion for their meals. And so they're seeing the benefits of, hey, my blood sugars are coming down. Oh, I'm losing weight. And it's because we've just normalized the portions that they're having. So they're not having, 2 servings of potatoes at dinner. They're just having 1. And suddenly they're seeing that benefit and that change. And it doesn't need to go to the extreme of no carbs whatsoever. As well, I always like to use the portion plate. I find this one is easy to incorporate. And if you're currently using a dinner plate at dinner, I highly recommend make the switch to a salad plate. Don't use the inner ring of your dinner plate. Everyone always tells me that they do, but that's just giving you kind of a false sense of hope that you're keeping it inside of the ring. Go right to the salad plate and use that to portion out your food and really kind of focus on this plate over here. Half your plate should be in particular vegetables, but also looking at your fruits and stuff like that as well. Looking at a quarter of your plate being carbohydrates and then a quarter of your plate being protein. But make your focus the protein and veggies, and generally the carbohydrate portion kind of works itself out. Now, one final thing that I always talk to people here about insulin resistance and diabetes is that people get very excited, particularly if you're wearing any of the CGM technology, so the Freestyle Libre, Dexcom sensor, or you're doing consistent finger pokes and stuff like that, is that when you eat a meal, there is going to be a spike in your blood sugars. For some reason, everyone believes that we should have our blood sugar should just be perfectly flat and there shouldn't be any ups and downs. The reality is that ups and downs happen. And I'm going to show you guys here. So this is the CGM data. So I'm currently have the Freestyle Libre 2 attached to my arm here. And this is kind of my blood sugar reading from yesterday. And so you can kind of see I don't have diabetes, but you can see each of the points when I had a meal. So my breakfast was over here and it spiked considerably. And my breakfast this morning was on its way up. So that's generally my heaviest carb portion meal of the day. So I certainly got a spike. And then you can see each of the times here that I had a meal of some kind. And I eat like 6 times a day. So each of those times there was a spike in my blood sugars came down. That is going to happen. Now, people who have insulin resistance and diabetes, the spike might be a little bit higher, absolutely, and it might take a little bit longer to come down. And that's just, again, because your body's not producing enough insulin. Yes, if we're getting into the very high blood sugars, so, greater than 11, 12, going up and up and up, that is more problematic. And we need to look at, what can we change and modify at that point in time. And that might be looking at medications and that sort of thing. But regardless, whatever you do, and when you have more candy and that sort of thing, and any refined sugars, you're going to get more of those spikes. And that is okay. That is just what your body's doing. It's processing and it's going to bring it back down. If it's consistently being up and staying up, then definitely we need to have a conversation about how we can help you to mitigate that. All right. And the CGM technology, if you have a plan that covers it, they're super cool. I get a real kick out of measuring them all and seeing the data and stuff like that. So, and it makes my job as a clinician super, super easy, like unbelievably easy to manage and mitigate. So, yeah, if you can, definitely look at them. They're fantastic. Anyways, on to activity. So, what is the best? And, a lot of people, it's gone back and forth as to like, well, I walk every single day. Is that good enough? What should I be doing? Do I need to go to the gym and lift weights and that sort of thing? So in reality, the evidence has gone back and forth. At one point, it was that resistance exercise was better. At another point, it was aerobic cardiovascular exercise was better. In reality, they're both equally effective. And in reality, we should try to do both. Cardiovascular activity, fantastic for maintaining your heart health, your vessel health, all that wonderful stuff. But also, you want to incorporate the weights because weights and resistance training or using elastic bands or what have you, that's going to help you to preserve your lean muscle tissue. And having more lean muscle tissue, not only if you're looking to lose weight, keeps your resting metabolic rate at a higher level, but also having more of that muscle just helps in so many ways and so many other aspects of your health. So if I had to choose, if you're torn between one or the other, or only had time for one or what have you, I would try to aim for resistance training. If you're doing the training and you're kind of doing a little bit more higher intensity, you certainly can get that heart rate up, but also working on strengthening and building the muscle as well. So it kind of gets two birds with one stone, if you will, but try and aim to do both of them if you can. Again, here's some of the goals. The biggest thing when it comes to activity is that we need to focus on health. Activity is just not an effective means to lose weight. It is great for maintaining your weight, but it really doesn't provide much extra benefit in terms of weight loss in any kind of way. The minimum we want to try to aim for is about 150 minutes per week or about 20 minutes per day. If we can get up to 300 minutes, even better. And find activities that you enjoy. I did a TikTok on this the other day, and we were talking about just how, activity and doing some of these lifestyle changes, they're going to suck, especially if you're new to it and you haven't ever done it before. Going to the gym, lifting weights, starting to walk every day when you haven't walked before, there is going to be some degree of suffering, and you're not always going to enjoy it. I don't enjoy every workout that I go to. I love the gym, but I don't always enjoy being there. But I always say I've never done a workout that I've ultimately regretted. And that's because I get all the health benefits that come afterwards. My mood improves, my sleep improves. There's so many other things that I get after working out and getting my activity in that ultimately makes me enjoy it and makes me want to go back and do it again. So keeping that in mind, that we want to try and find things that you do enjoy, but there is always going to be some degree of suckage that comes with it. And that is just the process of being a human being and us evolved to want to avoid suffering of any kind. And Dr. Yanni Friedhoff is a obesity physician out in Ontario. And his quote here is, "Some is good, more is better, but everything counts." So always keeping that in mind. And if you want some additional activity support of any kind, check out the app Go Get Fit. And if you use the code right here, DBHCE, you'll actually be logged under one of my observational panels. And so I'll be able to track and see how you're doing in terms of activity, as well as kind of send encouraging messages on a week-to-week basis or what have you, just to check in and to help keep you motivated and moving in the right direction. So this is kind of an activity support app that kind of works on a whole psychological aspect of things to support you and helping you to get moving a little bit more. Sleep, so important. I used to be the biggest culprit of not getting enough sleep. I used to believe that I could run on 5 to 6 hours of sleep. And it wasn't until last September that I actually started sleeping and making an effort to sleep anywhere from 7 to 8 hours. And since I've done that, the results have been absolutely dramatic. Like, it's been incredible how much my life has changed in so many ways of just getting a couple extra hours of sleep. I can be more effective. I can be more efficient. I get more done in a day. I feel so much better. Like, I always felt like this was just the reality. Like, this is what life felt like. And working as a full-time adult, I'm like, this sucks. This is brutal. And I've just gotten so many health benefits from it. And I'm in such a better person because I've gotten more sleep. And one of the big things is I think most people don't get enough sleep on a regular basis. And it's so vitally important. And it's really being potentially looked at as one of the major risk factors for the development of obesity. Leads to stress, inflammation, mood changes. It affects your appetite. It screws up the whole primal brain and makes us crave more of the sugary sweets to help counteract the tiredness. Like, the list is endless in what a proper night's sleep can do for us. Now, I know a number of people struggle with sleep, and I'm sure you've had the conversation about sleep hygiene. The basics of a cool room, cool pillow, keeping all the lights off, turning off the screens an hour before bed. Those are all great and fantastic. What I have found to be the most effective for my patients is going to bed at the same time and waking up at the same time. Even if you sleep terribly all night long, but you get up at your 6 a.m. time, you go about your day, and then you go to bed at your 9 or 10 p.m. or what have you, over time, if you can do that consistently, your sleep is going to ultimately improve in the long term. It takes some time. You need to be patient with it. It really, yeah, it can take upwards of a month. It can take a couple of months. But if you work on it consistently, your sleep will significantly improve over time, and you'll be able to sleep for a longer and longer duration. And yeah, really, that's kind of one of the best tips that I give to people. But it does take a lot of work. It does take a lot of really tired days. But if you can get through them, you can certainly improve your sleep patterns in the long term. As well, if any of you, if you snore, if you wake up in the night gasping, if you have any daytime sleepiness, get tested for sleep apnea. I've had patients whose lives have been fundamentally changed by having a CPAP machine. It can do so many great things for your health again, and just helping to make sure you're getting enough oxygen through the night and taking that stress off your body. Stress management, this is always a tough one because a lot of the situations and things that we tend to stress about are things that we cannot control. We can do absolutely nothing about them. And, you can't just quit your job if that's one of your major stress points. So I always like to take the approach of, well, these are the things that I can't control. What can I control? What can I do something about at this moment? And starting to look at how you can kind of problem solve and take control of different aspects of your life. And having that control in other areas ultimately is going to help you to let go of the areas you can't control and give you power back to ultimately move forward and fundamentally manage your stress. And as always, regardless if you have mental health disorders or not, I always tell everybody you should get therapy. You should be talking to an independent third party that is separate from your friends, your family, someone who doesn't really know the ins and the outs of your life that you can just spill your guts to. They won't tell anybody else. And then you can leave, or they can provide you different insights as to why the things that you do on a day-to-day basis. There's always areas that we can improve on. And if therapy is something you haven't engaged in, I highly encourage everyone. I go to a therapist, and I have had depression, anxiety. I've had my own issues and stuff like that. But essentially, having a therapist just kind of helps me to take my abilities and things that I'm doing to just a different level, because I have more insight and more cognitive awareness as to what I do and why I'm doing what I'm doing and stuff. And then finally, finding and doing what makes you happy. Now, weight loss, the big thing that I'm sure all of you have been waiting on. Certainly in managing insulin resistance, diabetes, weight loss has a demonstrated benefit. Back in the 1950s, they were seeing this benefit, and we still see it in the literature today that a 5 to 10% loss from your baseline body weight can dramatically reduce your metabolic abnormalities. So it's not even that much. And even some data shows that if you can lose up to 3%, you can help to reduce something like fatty liver and reduce the inflammation in your liver, which is huge because inflammation in your liver can be very, very bad and in the long term can be harmful. Stay tuned for a future webinar on fatty liver. But yeah, it may possibly reverse insulin resistance and prevent diabetes if you can achieve and maintain that weight loss into the long term. So definitely a lot of benefit that can potentially come out of it. However, weight loss can always be challenging. And, in my practice, the focus is never on weight loss specifically. It's always on health and engaging in all those health behaviors that we've already gone through in terms of diet and exercise. Because ultimately, when you start engaging in those patterns and behaviors, weight loss, if there is weight that needs to be lost, just happens as a secondary outcome. It's quite dramatic. And when we make that focus, we make that shift and make the health our most important aspect versus the number on our scales, that is when I see my patients make the most progress in every single facet of their life. So something to keep in mind that the number on the scale, again, doesn't mean a lot. Focusing on those health behaviors like activity and stuff, they are going to have so much more benefit. Even if you don't lose any weight and you engage in those behaviors, those are going to help to reduce your risk of insulin resistance and things like metabolic syndrome. There's data around that. Very, very interesting area and certainly a growing area in that aspect. So let's quickly touch on the medications. In terms of metabolic syndrome itself, there is like no drug that I can give you that treats metabolic syndrome. Basically, what we look at is the various abnormalities and how can we mitigate and manage those, but also looking at what can we do to provide you with cardiovascular protection. So insulin resistance, weight loss, metformin, GLP-1s, the thiazolidones, sorry. So that'd be pioglitazone or rosiglitazone. They're not older drugs. They're kind of older, but not really. They're not really used anymore because rosiglitazone had some stuff with heart failure as a potential red flag, and pioglitazone had some stuff maybe with bladder cancer. If you're on them, they're still very effective drugs at what they do. There is just those long-term potential risks that are associated with them, and certainly don't discontinue them because of this slide by any means. And finally, the SGLT should be SGLT2s. They're the kind of newer kids on the market, and they help us to reduce our sugar levels, also protect our heart, and all those great things as well. And then finally, high blood pressure, cholesterol meds. That's kind of just some of the various things that we look at in helping you to mitigate and manage those metabolic abnormalities. And some people need a lot of these drugs. Some people need a couple of them. It varies individual to individual, but they can be very effective at reducing your cardiovascular risk. Overall, talk to your care team and for more advice. Finally, bariatric surgery. Again, very, very effective, especially at the extremes. They certainly can reverse metabolic abnormalities. They can reverse insulin resistance, type 2 diabetes. Really, really great success with them. And they're becoming safer and safer modalities that we are looking at. General qualifications, say if here in Canada, if it were to be covered by the public system, your BMIs generally have to be greater than 40 and or a BMI greater than or equal to 35 with obesity related comorbidities. So essentially metabolic comorbidities, whether it's hypertension, diabetes, that sort of thing. Again, speak to your care team if you think bariatric surgery might be an option for you. Certainly, maybe talk to your doctor, see what you can do. We kind of take a stepwise approach, and generally if you're going to get referred to a bariatric clinic of some kind, what's ultimately going to happen is they're probably going to put you on medication first and focus on that aspect and get you prepped for potential surgery down the road. So a lot of different ways to go about it, and certainly a lot of tools in the toolbox to help us mitigate and manage these things. So my final conclusions here for you. As I said, obesity, insulin resistance, diabetes, the jury is really still out on that. There's a complex interplay and a lot of different moving pieces that are going on there, and a number of different factors that, largely a lot of them might be out of individuals' control, and some of them we might be able to do something about. But nonetheless, there's a lot of variation in that respect of it. In reality, insulin resistance and obesity are really part of a bigger picture of this metabolic syndrome that we're getting concerned about and we need to be focusing on. And finally, management is possible. We can do something about it. Lifestyle modifications are kind of the staple and the very first thing that we should be focusing on and looking at, but certainly there's nothing wrong with adding on the medications and the bariatric surgery. Likely you'll need to take them for the duration of your life, but that's okay. They're helping you to mitigate and manage these things that can be driven by genetics and other factors that you can do nothing about. My final tips for you here, I often talk about this as kind of my approach and my strategy with my patients and my clients, is the very first thing before you overhaul your diet or make any big changes, collect the data. Data is power. You can really do so much with the data and understanding of what your own patterns and behaviors are. So looking at what are you eating, what are you consuming, what are your feelings, how much activity you're getting, collect everything you can. And really what this initial activity does is it starts to help to incorporate a consistent pattern in your life. If you do it for 1 week, fantastic. If you do it for 2 weeks, that's better. You start consistently writing down or taking note of all these various things, and you get a better idea of where these things are at and where you can kind of start from. Because once you have the data, you can start looking for the patterns and start identifying what areas do you think you could change. So skipping breakfast, are you binging later in the evening because of that? Okay, maybe we need to incorporate a breakfast to help mitigate that. Or when I did have breakfast, I wasn't as hungry at night. Not sleeping well. Okay, what's going on there? You know, are we staying up late? Are we procrastinating before bed? What's happening in that respect of it? Is there a lack of activity in your life? How can you increase that activity? Thinking about various aspects in that respect and what you can do there. And again, start with one small change, be as specific as possible. You know, my patients, I think I always drive them nuts when they set a goal. And then I say, okay, we're going to do it 3 times a week. Okay. What days of the week are we going to do it? What time of the day are we going to do it? Getting more and more specific as possible is ultimately going to ingrain it deeper into your mind. And the more scheduled it is, the easier it is going to be for you to execute on it, but also to prepare for it, to get the various aspects of things in place so that to make it happen. And then finally, you're going to fail. You're going to fail many, many, many times. The biggest thing is to learn what worked, what didn't work, make some changes, and then repeat. And always remember, small tweaks lead to massive peaks. Always like to highlight this, that really, this is amazing what it can do. The small little tweaks, they'll add up and they ultimately lead to the mountain that you're trying to climb. So that is my references. You can take a look there. This Malone paper right here for anybody that's interested. I'm pretty sure it's free. This was a fantastic read. Really enjoyed that one. But all these references here, I kind of breezed through over the last few weeks here. And a quick shout out for my next webinar series. The webinar event is already live on Eventbrite. We'll be blasting it out on various social media channels and stuff like that. But we're going to look at managing your weight with polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS. I know a number of my followers deal with this on a regular basis. So we'll dive a little bit into what is polycystic ovarian syndrome, what are we dealing with, and how do we manage your weight in respect of that. This event will be a ticketed event, so it won't be put up on YouTube, or we won't be doing a Facebook Live with it. It will be $5 plus the associated fees that are with that. So I think it's like 6 something or such like that. That's just to help to kind of recuperate some of the costs in terms of my time and the various webinar platforms and that sort of thing. So yeah, I hope you guys can come out, and I'm looking forward to seeing you there. Other than that, you can find me on my various channels. We've got my YouTube channel, Dr. Dan Weight Loss via Habit Mastery, and pretty much all the social media channels at the official Dr. Dan. And if any of you want to join the HE family with Dr. Dan, this is a private Facebook group where I answer questions and you can share your triumphs and successes. And yeah, we can kind of go from there. So we shall open it up to questions now. I know there's a number of them here. We'll start here. All right. First question, we will not be providing e-certificates for it. Nope. From Facebook, Sabrina Tremblay, thank you for this. To me, it is clear that insulin resistance was causing obesity. As soon as I started metformin, my TSH levels stabilized, which had been going to extreme levels for 15 years. Before that, I got my period back and I lost 70 pounds with no effort. But now, 8 years on, it seems I got used to that dosage and everything's back. Okay, if there's a question there, let me know, please. Thank you so much. Very much appreciated. My pleasure. Great presentation. Can you comment on where the no fruit with those in diabetes come from? Additionally, many patients with diabetes are convinced when they see meat, they need a unique amount of carbs. Does the literature suggest a lower carbohydrate for those with diabetes? So in general, yes. So in general, yes, the data does show that if we consume a lower amount of carbs, that's ultimately going to help with the insulin resistance aspect of things. So, you know, if you can get to a lower amount, fantastic. There is good data to show that, and ultimately a lower carb diet with lower calories leading to weight loss certainly can have that extended benefit. Again, though, there's good data to show that even on a higher carb diet, I think there was, I can't remember if there was diabetics included in the study, but they did a vegetarian vegan diet versus a low carb diet. And it was the vegan vegetarian diet was very high carb. And what they found is actually the high carb people actually may have done better in terms of not only weight loss and some of the other markers and stuff. I'd have to go re-review that study, but yeah, even high carb, it is possible. So it's not necessary to have a lower amount of carbs. But I think, again, what people often see is that you see a dramatic reduction when you go from high carb to no carb, particularly if you're doing blood sugar testing or if you have a glucose monitor on or something like that. Like all of a sudden, hey, I just had protein and salad for lunch. Like my sugars didn't spike. So people get really excited and they get that kind of that warped feeling in their head that that's what I need to see every single time. And no one has really explained to them that your sugars are going to spike. Protein is going to cause an insulin response. Protein is also going to cause a potential rise in your blood sugars, maybe not as dramatically as sugars, but that's just the reality. That's how your body functions and operates, and that is okay. So there's no specific amounts. Again, it's going to depend on the patient. If that worked for them, fantastic. In terms of the no fruit, I think that actually goes back to the whole high fructose corn syrup aspect of things. I don't know if you guys remember that from a few years ago. It's not quite as popular anymore because what we ultimately found with high fructose corn syrup is that basically refined sugars of large amounts are just not that great for you, and you should try to reduce them, whether it's high fructose corn syrup or just refined sugars in general. And I think fructose got kind of tied up in the fact that that it's fruit. Fructose comes from fruit, so we should cut out fruit as well. And that's definitely not the case. As well, there was some talk about how fructose it gets converted to fats, or it has to go through your liver first before it can do some other things in that respect. And I think people got caught up in that aspect that it was causing fatty liver and such like that. In reality, the data again shows that you can consume fruit and still lose weight. We still want to be mindful of how much fruit we're consuming because fruit does have calories, it does have sugar, but you know, you can definitely have the fruit. And I always recommend fruit because fruit compared to say juices and high fructose corn syrup, yes, there's fructose in fruit, but you also have the fiber, the vitamins, the minerals, all the good stuff that comes with it. So certainly there is no reason to completely cut it out by any means. But yeah, that's kind of where I would think the no fruit aspect kind of came from and got a bad name from. So hopefully that helps. Sorry if I missed it. How are metabolic issues diagnosed like insulin resistance? Yeah, I didn't really go into the diagnostic criteria around this. So insulin resistance in particular, right now what we use is the oral glucose tolerance test is kind of our gold standard. However, most physicians will kind of screen with a hemoglobin A1C, which is kind of your 3-month average of what your blood sugars are doing. And that if that's starting to trend and it's, I think it's 5.7 to 6.4, you're considered pre-diabetes, and then 6.4 and above, we're getting more into the diabetes range of things and such like that. So they'll look at A1C or they'll look at a fasting blood sugar, and you know, you could have impaired fasting glucose where your fasting blood sugar, if it's greater than 7, that indicates that, hey, there's insulin resistance going on. You're actually at the point where your insulin levels have started to decrease and the sugar levels have started to increase at that point in time. So that's kind of the diagnostic criteria around that in terms of insulin resistance, and currently our gold standard, if you will. So it's kind of already on the downward slope where insulin levels have started to decrease and sugars have started to increase on the counter side of things. Thanks, excellent. I appreciate it. Okay. I have PCOS and type 2 diabetes. I've been on metformin and Ozempic for a few years. I was 300 pounds, but I'm now 240 pounds. My blood sugars continue to be between 9 and 15. My doctor would like to start me on insulin daily, but it scares me. Once you start insulin, do you ever come off of it? I've asked to be referred for weight loss surgery. Is this a better option than injecting insulin? Okay, so multiple things here. So first and foremost, we always need to keep in mind that with this insulin resistance and the development of diabetes, it is a chronic and progressive disease. So even if we get your blood sugars very, very well controlled, what's still going to happen is that those beta cells over time are still going to deteriorate and die. There's nothing you can do about it. In fact, every single person on the planet, if we all lived long enough, we would all eventually develop diabetes, because once you're born, essentially, well, I don't even know what you're born, it's probably like around your 30s or so, every single cell in your body starts to deteriorate, and fundamentally things just don't work as well. So same thing with your pancreas. You're kind of just shifted down now that you have diabetes, and you're going to just seem like you're accelerating at a greater rate, but it's just the fact that you had more initial damage, but you're still going on the same trend. Even if your blood sugars are really well controlled, there's still going to be that progressiveness of the disease, and what worked a couple of years ago, we're probably going to need to add more on to mitigate and manage it. Okay, so that's the first thing. In terms of insulin, I mean, generally with these medications and any kind of metabolic conditions and disease and stuff like that, these are lifelong conditions. These are things that we need to mitigate and manage well into the future for the rest of our life. And that is ultimately just a reality of it. Some people with more drastic lifestyle changes could potentially come off insulin, for sure. Other people, not so much. So it really varies individual to individual. But primarily, if we're getting to the point where your sugars need to be controlled with insulin, insulin's going to be a lifelong drug. Now, I think insulin also gets a very bad rap, because insulin's very effective at what it does. It's replacing what your body no longer can produce. And again, insulin, when you have excess calories going into the system, yeah, insulin can again cause weight gain and that sort of thing. But if we're controlling, and looking at your lifestyle patterns and modifications, that weight gain can be very minimal, if any whatsoever. So if you're doing all the correct things with your life and just your sugars are elevated, yeah, the insulin can bring you down and can be effective, and we can continue to titrate it up to ultimately prevent and manage your various conditions and that sort of thing. And would bariatric surgery be a better option? I mean, depending. I mean, there's risks with anything. And even if you get the bariatric surgery, again, you might lose some more weight, you might correct for a while, and then eventually you might need to go on insulin. So it all kind of depends, person to person and on your individual case. So there's a lot of other things there that I would need to know to kind of assess on an individual basis, but it might be, it might not be. And you might eventually need insulin anyways, or more agents. And that's just, again, the chronic progressiveness of all these conditions and diseases, that it's not so much that they're just going to go away later on in life, unfortunately. So hopefully that helps on that respect. 9 questions here. Does everyone with obesity have insulin resistance? So not everyone with obesity seems to have insulin resistance. Yeah, interestingly enough, kind of as we noted there, people might have insulin resistance and might not ever develop diabetes potentially. But I would say that not everybody with obesity has insulin resistance. How is fatty liver diagnosed? So there's a couple of ways that we diagnose fatty liver. First thing we look at is generally, you'll kind of notice it, say your ALT or your liver enzymes will start to be elevated. So ALT, AST, maybe GGT, depending on the situation. But ALT is a liver enzyme. So it's an enzyme that's found within inside of your liver cells, essentially. And what'll happen when fat starts to infiltrate the liver and your liver starts to get angry is your liver cells will burst open, and that ALT will get released into the bloodstream and ultimately will rise in the bloodstream. And when they do a blood draw at the lab, it'll be like, oh, hey, your ALT is on the high side. And so something's telling us that there's something inflammatory, your liver's pissed off, it's a little angry, and it's releasing the ALT into the bloodstream. So, hey, can we do something to manage it? Then, I mean, the gold standard would be to do a fibroscan, but fibroscans are kind of few and far between and a little bit harder to find. Generally, like say in Alberta here, fibroscans aren't actually covered by Alberta Health. You'd have to pay out of pocket to get a fibroscan. The alternative would be an ultrasound, but it's not as specific. It's more like, oh, it's diffuse, there's fatty liver and maybe features of steatosis. Excuse me. But in reality, a fibroscan will be able to tell us what level of fibrosis is currently going on, if there is any whatsoever, or in that regard of it. So that's kind of how we go about diagnosing that. If my A1C is at a 6, is that high? It's on the higher end. So you're kind of starting to get into that pre-diabetes territory. Ultimately, it's yeah, it could be on the higher end. I would continue to monitor and watch it, and yeah, keep following up with your care team. Thoughts on why lots of protein makes me nauseous? Is it because of what you talked about with the insulin spiking with protein? Probably not. It's probably more just the fact that, yeah, you maybe just your body does not respond as well to protein. And so, or you just, you have some intolerances and that sort of thing. I mean, it really, again, it varies person to person. And I would just continue to try and find the foods and things that ultimately work for you and that you can tolerate. It doesn't cause those side effects. And yeah, continue to play with it and tweak it. But I wouldn't say it's because of the insulin spiking. No. Um, I'm using a CGM and bananas spike my glucose. Also, should there be a range I try to stay in? Fasting glucose is around 90. Um, I'll have to convert it. I cannot remember the conversions for US units right now. But so generally our targets that we're looking for in terms of your blood sugar levels, fasting. So first thing when you wake up in the morning, we want to try to be less than 7. So that'd be first thing in the morning. And if you go and find a calculator online, you'll be able to convert that over. I just cannot remember the US units right now. And then generally 2 hours after meal, we aim anywhere from 5 to 8 or 5 to 10. The lower it can be 2 hours after meal, the better. But ultimately it's going to vary meal to meal and what you're consuming, what you're eating and that sort of thing, and what stage of your disease you're currently in. So so yeah, that's kind of that. Generally, that's the targets that we would aim for. And yeah, just try to be mindful of. I was encouraged by a fitness instructor to eat 40 protein, 30 carbs, and 30 fats. Um, I mean, that might work for you. So I'm assuming 40% protein, 30% carbs, and 30% fat for your diet. I mean, that might work for you. Again, I would just look at what you're eating on a day-to-day basis and what ultimately is going to work for you. I mean, I focus more on, like I said, using the plate method and trying to have a quarter of your plate being protein. And what that's going to equate out to be is that's going to be about 20 to 30 grams of protein at each meal. And if we start looking at snacks, it's about 10 to 20 grams of protein at your snacks and such. And so I'd be looking at that and then increasing your veggies, and then everything else can kind of follow through on the other side of it. But I wouldn't get too detailed in the 40, 30, 30 kind of aspect of things. Just keep it simple and go from there. Thoughts on Dr. Fung and the diabetic code book? Oh, I don't know if we have enough time for that. I'm not a particular fan of Dr. Jason Fung. I think he's misinterpreting a lot of the evidence that's currently out there, and he's built such a product around this idea of fasting and insulin being evil and such that he can't really go back on the insulin or back on the evidence, and so he's constantly trying to pick apart and make straw man arguments against the data that has more conclusively shown that insulin is not this big bad molecule that we thought it was. And fasting and ketosis isn't the end all be all in terms of weight loss. So I think that's more or less what's happened there, is that, he is a physician, he is a nephrologist. But yeah, he's kind of gotten too far down a rabbit hole that if he were to suddenly backpedal and start changing his mind, I mean, that would crumble his whole brand and essentially identity and stuff like that. So I don't know if he actually truly does believe it or not. But I think he's putting out a lot of misinformation, causing a lot of confusion. He no doubt has helped a number of people if those dietary patterns and such work for them. But overall, I find it's ultimately too extreme, and ultimately a number of his patients that have gone through his various programs have ended up on my doorstep, and I kind of have to pick up the pieces afterwards and kind of start from the beginning. So that's kind of some of my initial thoughts on that, if you will. Is fatty liver fat in the liver versus around the liver? It is definitely infiltrating within the liver, around the liver, around your various organs. Same thing in your heart tissues. Yeah, when we start getting that visceral fat, so the fat that's around our organs, it basically infiltrates and goes everywhere, and it changes like the whole like when we look at an ultrasound, for example, changes the whole picture of your ultrasound and what your liver should look like. And yeah, and it's even fats being taken up by your liver cells as well and causing issues in that respect. Thank you for this talk. You cover many factors affecting weight gain and loss that are often missed. You said you think that type 2 diabetes causes obesity. How do you reconcile this with the data in the direct trial that showed diabetes remission with weight loss in a dose-dependent fashion? The more weight loss, more likely. Yes. So that is a question that we would need to have a discussion about afterwards. But the direct trial, yes, is kind of on the flip side of showing that, yes, as you lost more weight, more of the diabetes was corrected and managed and mitigated. Just kind of, I guess, a brief summary is that when we start looking at kind of more of the molecular mechanisms that are happening on the on the molecular basis and stuff like that, and we start looking at kind of some of the molecules and the processes in terms of not only what's happening with regards to fat uptake and then lipolysis and the whole pathway in terms of how, when our blood sugar levels rise, insulin levels try to go up and counteract it. But if that insulin resistance is too high, ultimately the nutrients aren't going to go from the bloodstream inside of the cells. And then so on the flip side, what starts happening is the body continues to freak out. All your cells continue to say, hey, we're not getting this sugar, we're not getting any nutrients. Then the body goes to your fat, starts releasing all of this fat and dumping this fat into the system. And ultimately that in process might actually be causing more of the process in terms of driving the process of leading to weight gain. And yeah, so I didn't explain that very well. There's a lot more in depth that we can go into in terms of the molecular mechanisms, and would be happy to discuss it afterwards, or at least send you a couple of papers on it. And yeah, so that's kind of just some counteracting with regards to the direct trial. But yeah, great question. Few other questions. One more, does your body differentiate between natural occurring sugars versus added sugars in terms of response to insulin and blood glucose? No. So basically glucose is glucose is glucose. Once it hits our bloodstream, your body is going to respond to it in the same way. It's more going to have maybe a difference in terms of how it's being moved through the digestive tract, if you will. So, if you have more sugar in, say, a fruit, you've got more fiber surrounding that fruit. And so that's going to slow the uptake of the glucose from that fruit into the bloodstream. And so that's going to affect the glucose pattern. But if you have, then you have the Sour Patch Kids candy or something, which is just pure sugar, doesn't have any fiber or protein around it, that's just going to be more directly absorbed as glucose, and that's going to see a much higher spike in your glucose levels. So in terms of that, the body isn't going to be mitigating and adjusting. It's just going to be more how the glucose is getting into the system and how much of a kind of the low versus high GI effects of it, if you will. Is it true that your body responds the same to diet soda as regular soda and spike your levels? So actually, part of the little experiment I'm going to do for you guys with the Libre sensors is to show that it does not cause a spike in your sugar levels, and does not cause any issues with regards to insulin or anything like that. Again, I have tons of videos. I think I have a YouTube on this one as well, talking about how diet soda, a lot of the evidence and some of the shortcomings of it, if you will. So it doesn't cause the same effect. If diet soda caused your insulin levels to spike like regular soda, diet soda fundamentally doesn't have any sugar in it. And so for people that were, say, drinking diet soda while fasted, if it spiked your insulin levels, they wouldn't have sugar going into the system, and they would all essentially be passing out and potentially dying because of hypoglycemia. So no, it doesn't have that same effect. Yeah, it's very much not the case that it causes that same response. Maybe diet sodas might increase your appetite or craving for sweet foods, but even then the evidence is pretty weak in that respect of it. So hopefully that helps. My insulin number is higher when I fast than when I eat. So, I mean, there could be various reasons or things that are going on there. If your blood sugar levels do go too low, so if you're dropping into lower levels or you have medications on board and stuff like that, your body is going to rebound and bring your blood sugar levels back up. That's fundamentally what our body does to keep everything in check. So when our blood sugars go too low, it triggers a stress response, and it needs to bring our blood sugars back up because it says, hey, blood sugars are way too low right now. This is problematic. We need to do something about it. it's often the symptoms that individuals that when they develop hypoglycemia, that's the stress response. That's the adrenal response from your body saying, hey, you need to go eat some sugar and get some food into the system. We're trying to counteract it, but you need to go do something about it right now. So that's increased heart rate, sweating, cravings, hunger, all that kind of stuff. So will IF be bad for me? I mean, not necessarily bad for you. The big question you need to ask is, can you do IF for the rest of your life, essentially? And if you can't, if you say no to that, then it might not be the best one for you. Can I test my blood sugar with other machines than pricking my finger? Yeah, if you can get the blood glucose or the continuous glucose monitor, so the Freestyle Libre or the Dexcom, both can be fantastic and great in that respect. So they can certainly be taken without measuring your blood sugar levels or doing a finger poke, if you will. Short of that, it would be going and doing a blood draw, and you're still going to get a poke in your arm anyways. But yeah, that's unfortunately where the technology is limited. I remember a couple of years ago, Google had like an eye lens or something that was able to measure our blood sugar from our eye, and I cannot remember what exactly happened with that, but who knows what the technology in the future will hold. And I think they're working on a patch that sits on your skin and just measures your blood sugar. But yeah, we still got a little ways to go. But the continuous glucose monitors are kind of the way of the future and really are starting to change how we manage diabetes and such. I forgot about the time change for this event and joined just now. Disappointed about this. Will you by chance be offering this again? So yes, all of this will be posted on YouTube probably in the next week or so. You'll be able to check it out there. You'll all get a message when it goes out as well. You should have all gotten the slides and such like that. So you'll definitely be able to re-review that and watch the video again as well. It'll be on my Facebook page. You can actually go and rewatch it right now if you'd like on the Facebook page, and that's Dr. Dan-Healthcare Evolution. So you can check it out there, and yeah, would be happy to chat. And if you guys have any questions or anything like that, feel free to shoot out to me on my various social media platforms. And yeah, I think that's it for questions. So really a lot of fantastic questions. And yeah, for the care providers, if you want a little bit more of a discussion back and forth, happy to chat. I would recommend checking out the Malone paper that I pointed out there in my references. It's yeah, a great little resource that kind of breaks down some of my thoughts around diabetes causing obesity and some of the back end respects of it. But I have a few other links and papers that I can definitely share on that respect too. So we'd love to chat more. And yeah, I think we will leave that at that. I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your evening. And yeah, stay tuned. Hopefully you can make it to the next one with PCOS and weight management. And we'll see you there.